Writing is one of the most important skills a person can develop while in education, but it's also one of the hardest. And when you think about it, it impacts every level of society, from writing articles for newspapers, to speeches for presidents and prime ministers, to scripts for movies, to literature, to academic writing. I mean, the impact is vast. Having said this, it's also sometimes difficult to decipher what is it that makes one piece of writing average and what makes one outstanding. And this is as true for academic writing as it is for any of the other types of writings that I've mentioned. Often when you read something, you just feel like it's good, as if it flows, as if it all makes sense. And to be honest, that's exactly how it should be when you're using some of those very subtle tactics. You want it to feel like it all just naturally happened on its own, not like you're trying too hard to impress the reader. And these are the very tactics and tools that I want to share with you in this video today. The tools that I've used in the last 6 years of university. And also we'll just go through some example essays that I've written, and then we'll pick them apart. We'll talk about where I've applied the rules or the tips, and also what makes that essay really good and where maybe I've had some shortcomings in writing it. So it should be a good learning process. But before we even start writing any essay, we need to appreciate that writing essays and marking them can be quite subjective. I mean, the way one teacher marks an essay can be quite different from the way another teacher marks an essay. They can give completely different grades. And that begs the question, how do we tackle this subjectivity? And the way I used to tackle it is through 3 simple steps. Number 1 is to delve into the source, and specifically the criteria that the teacher should be using in order to grade their students. At my university, we had an overarching kind of mark scheme or scheme of assessment that the teacher should be using, and I had a look at it, and that criteria divided the percentages into their specific grades. So for us, a first class was the highest grade you could get, and the first class was 70 or over, so 70, 80, 90%, that was all first class. And then the next step was a 2-1, which is 60 to 69%, and then you move down that way. So let's focus on the top kind of bracket. So in order to get a first class in an essay at the university I was at, the mark scheme said that a well organized and well expressed answer which shows very good understanding and evidence of independent study or critical evaluation. The specific thing that's highlighted here is evidence of independent study or critical evaluation, because that is the differentiating factor between the grade that is below it, because that was described as generally well organized and well expressed, similar to the top one, which shows good understanding, but then there's no mention of evidence of independent study. So what that suggests, when I'm writing this essay, I need to include a few points that demonstrates that I've actually read slightly beyond the lectures that had been taught. Not too many, I don't need to be an expert, but a few points that show that I've done some specific research. And that is what will get me the top grade, so I appreciated that, and that was fine. And then also what you see is that the differentiating factors between 70s and 80s and 90s are not very clear. So in the 70s you show a very good understanding, in the 80s you show an excellent understanding, and then in the 90s up to 100 you show an outstanding understanding, or you cover the criteria in an outstanding way. So then the tips that we talk about later on will play a role in making that essay move from very good to excellent to outstanding. And then we move on from that, and we realize that actually this mark scheme is somewhat still subjective, because what might be outstanding to one person might be excellent to another, might be very good to another, might be good to another person. So there is some subjectivity playing here. And so what I would do then, after having read this mark scheme, is to book a meeting with the teacher that had set that essay. So I'd have a meeting just to share my ideas about how I'm planning to structure things that I'm planning to talk about, and get their opinion, because they set the essay, they know exactly what they are looking for. And often they'd be happy to do this because it shows that initiative, and that's something that I think most people like to see in their students. And then step number 3, finally, once we've done all of this, is to analyze the question that has been set very, very meticulously. This is key because you're making sure that you're answering the question that has been asked. You're not answering a different question or a question that you feel more comfortable with. So one of the essays that I had was titled "Discuss the Potential Targeting of Rho Kinase for the Treatment of Cardiovascular Diseases." So this was an essay that I still did quite well at. I did get a first class, but I wasn't able to push it into the 90s. And the specific reason was because I didn't address the question quite that well. So the two important aspects of this question were targeting of Rho kinase and treatment of cardiovascular diseases. So I covered targeting of Rho kinase in huge detail. So I talked about smooth muscle contraction, I talked about Rho kinase pathway, I talked about hypertension and the mechanism of atherosclerosis, but I didn't spend that much talking about novel treatments that target Rho kinase. I think I only spent like 2 paragraphs here discussing clinical studies, and then I think somewhere in here as well I kind of touched upon the different therapies that are available. I should have spent at least half of this essay talking about the different treatments that are available. So here's an example of how you can analyze the question a bit better. So now that we've covered the prerequisites of essay writing, we can move on to the 5 tools that I used to use in order to really get more out of the essay that I was writing. And the first one is essay planning. I can't stress enough how important that is. I mean, look, when I was in high school and the teachers were like, oh, plan your essay is really important. I'm not gonna lie, I used to just be like, stop overdoing it. But the reality is that when you're writing an essay, it's like when you're trying to get to a destination without a roadmap and you're literally just walking in any direction, hoping that you just land in that place. That's what it's like to write an essay without a plan. And my plan would usually just be very, very simple. I'd allocate maybe out of an hour, 5 to 7 minutes just planning the essay, and it would include mainly the subheadings of those essays, so 3, 4, 5 different subheadings, and I would name them, and under those subheadings I'd include maybe 3 to 4 points that I wanted to write about under that subheading in the essay. And that way, you know, I've planned the essay and all I need to do now is just move on and write each paragraph really, or each subheading literally. Whereas, you know, if you don't have a plan, then it's almost like you're constantly trying to come up with things to say, and then you think, oh, I've just come up with this, but this is really the wrong place that I should be including it in. I wish I included it somewhere else. And especially in exams, then you can't like rub out everything and try and write it again. You could probably do that if it's an assignment or something like that, but yeah, plan your essays. Now we move on to tool number 2, and that's the introduction of the essay. And the introduction of the essay should really be like a sales pitch. Why should this person invest their attention into reading your essay? I mean, I understand they still have to read it anyway because they're your teacher and they're marking it. But if they emotionally invested in it and you've taken them through a journey, they're more likely to enjoy the read and thereby give you a better mark. So let's take the example of that same Rho kinase essay that I wrote, and I felt like this introduction was quite good. So let's analyze it. So off the bat, I started off with some compelling statistics that are bound to kind of capture the person's or the reader's attention. So cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide, nearly 160,000 deaths per year in the UK. And then we move on to the financial impact, which is 1.8 billion spending by the NHS and 6.7 billion societal cost. Okay, so these are some quite important statistics, right? But that's all on a societal level. What happens at an individual level? And then we moved on to saying, you know, it leads to a lower quality of life, it leads to chest pain, it leads to edema, it leads to inability to exercise. So now we've introduced the problem, right? We've introduced the problem. Once you've introduced the problem, it's time to slide in the solution, because that's how a story works, right? You've got a beginning, you've got the middle, and the middle is usually a challenge or a problem, and then at the end you've got kind of the resolution, or in this case the solution. And the solution here then is what this article is going to discuss, and that's what I said. The focus of this article will therefore be Rho kinase, as well as clinical studies to evaluate its potential as a target for cardiovascular disease. So this new kind of target might be the solution to all of those problems that we've mentioned before this. And now we move on to the third tool, which is storytelling. Once you've caught the reader's attention, you want the essay to follow a logical story. And one of the ways that you can make that happen is to make sure that each paragraph, or at least each subheading, ends in a way in order to allow natural flow into the next one. So let's give a few examples of that. So now let's move on to a different essay, which was my dissertation. At the end of the subheading of cancer as a disease, I mentioned that this project aims to discover novel chemotherapeutics against leukemia. Therefore, much of the focus will be on current knowledge of leukemia and chemotherapeutics in this disease. So once I've ended with that, and I've mentioned, the focus will be leukemia, then that begs the question, what is leukemia? The next subheading is then leukemia. Leukemia is a subcategory of cancers characterized by progressive, malignant, neoplasm, whatever. So see, we've introduced leukemia in the paragraph before it and got the reader to ask the question, okay, so this project will focus on leukemia. What is leukemia in the first place? Well, the next paragraph explains exactly what that is. So that's an example of allowing flow between different paragraphs. Now we move on to the fourth tool, which is diagrams. Part of what a person thinks about your essay is psychological. They want to feel like you deserve that really high mark before they give it to you. They want to feel like you have put in sufficient work before they give you that high mark. And one way that I'll try to utilize this is by making my own diagrams from scratch and not just copying any random diagram from Google or Wikipedia. So a few examples. So in my dissertation, almost every single diagram I made from scratch. So for example, the diagram that discussed artesunate and how it causes apoptosis in cells, I made that all from scratch. The diagram that discusses the life cycle of Plasmodium falciparum, which is a type of malaria, and how it goes through the mosquito, liver, and all of that. Every single green dot, I made that myself. Even in the raw kindness essay, I made most of those diagrams myself as well. There was one diagram which was quite difficult to make. It was the one about smooth muscle cells and the pathway or the mechanisms that smooth muscle cells contract by. And I made that all from scratch. And this way, when I put the diagram in the essay, I don't need to reference anyone else because I made it. And the same thing goes for essays in exams. In exams, obviously, you can't reference another person's diagram, but what I would do is prepare diagrams beforehand. So I would try and figure out what types of essays are going to come up in the exam, and then I'd make loads of diagrams beforehand that I memorize, and then as soon as I go into the exam, I would make sure I utilize those diagrams in my explanation or in my essay writing. And now this takes us on to the final tool, and that is language use. And the rule here is that it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. And these rules are kind of unsaid in academic writing. And falling into these mistakes can make you seem a bit like an amateur when you're writing. So let's talk about how you can use language in a good way and the mistakes to avoid. First thing is not to mention yourself or not to mention any personal pronouns. So for example, don't say, in this project, I will, or in this essay, I aim to. Instead, you can say, this project aims to, or this essay sets out to discuss. So what we've removed there is the I or the personal pronouns, and you're kind of disassociating yourself from it. It's almost like you're making it seem less subjective in some way. I guess that's the kind of psychology behind it. Another pitfall is the use of to do. So for example, instead of saying, there was a research group in Japan and they did some experiments, you can just slightly tweak that to say, a research group in Japan carried out some experiments. Or a research group in Japan performed some experiments. Alternatively, here's a mistake which combines both of those. So instead of saying, I did some experiments by taking nitric oxide, you can say, this experiment was carried out by using nitric oxide or whatever. Yeah, so you can see those slight tweaks there. And also another tip that is used for any type of writing is that you'd rather use a shorter form of a sentence than a longer one. So instead of waffling, it's better to say something in a short and concise way. So I had an example, actually, let's read it out. Instead of saying, it is due to the fact that CO2 emissions have risen that climate change has taken importance. Okay, that just sounds like a whole lot of waffle. You can just say, it is due to a rise in CO2 emissions, climate change has taken importance. Bam, you've basically cut out the BS. So yeah, I think that is all the tips that I had in this video. I hope it was useful. These are some tips that you can definitely use for the exams that people have at home and stuff. I'm hearing that people have like 24 hours or 48 hours to write their essays at home because of quarantine and coronavirus and all of that. So yeah, you can use this. You can use all of these tips. You can make your own diagrams. You can really think about how to structure your essays. I hope that was useful. If it was useful, then like and comment. Make sure to follow on the Instagram and holler back at your boy another day. Safe.